Hello. In this video we're going to be discussing Lecture 3 of Adorno's An Introduction to Dialectics. So this lecture repeats a lot of what we've explored in Lectures 1 and 2, but this lecture goes just a bit more in depth, and it's with a slightly different angle, so that we understand it with a varied perspective. We're constantly renewing our own thoughts about dialectical thinking in a dialectical manner. I don't feel right. Something doesn't feel right here. In Lecture 3, we get deep into thinking about the whole in relation to the parts, and how the whole is not fixed, not a mere result at the end of having critically thought through different antagonisms. Actually, the result is the process, and this is the truth, the absolute, the system. That is the truth. We'll go into this in a bit more detail as we go along. Got an orange. I don't know why, I just like playing with them and eating them sometimes. Dialectical thinking is not mechanical, but that's not to say that it's totally organicist either. It's about that mediation. So, grab a hot drink and an orange if you want, and let's begin. Adorno begins Lecture 3 with an overview of Lecture 2. He explains that in Lecture 2, we learned that dialectical thinking shows us how truth is not static, and something, therefore, like an idea, is not permanent, and it's not self-evident. So to think dialectically, you have to accept that concepts and truth are not permanent. They change throughout time and according to contexts. And we mustn't just assume that this is the way things are because this is just the way things are, because what is that? We have invented these concepts. This isn't a discussion about anything like morality or anything like that. It's merely a discussion about the notion of things existing and us adhering to them as if they are outside ourselves, and how we should critique things. I'm not saying that it's wrong that we've come up with them and therefore we shouldn't listen to them or anything like that. It's just an observation. That's all this is about. Observe it with an open mind and not jump to any conclusions. Concepts are there for a reason. So, Adorno writes that, in our last session I tried to provide a foretaste of the central difficulty of dialectical thought, namely that its concept of truth itself is not a static one, that dialectical thought has broken with the notion of the idea as something essentially permanent, immutable, and self-identical. So all you need to know for now is that dialectical thinking is something which critiques the idea that things are fixed, static, and immutable. It wants us to think this concept need not apply to now, if that is the case, having thought through it dialectically. Now, because truth is constantly changing, dialectical thought does not involve any principles or anything dogmatic, because this would imply a fixed concept and an invariance of truth. Adorno writes, dialectical thought differs from traditional thought in the sense that the former does not hunt after some absolute first ground or principle, for the pursuit of such a ground ultimately involves the idea of the invariance of truth. Now, if you think about it, as Adorno writes, the entire conception of philosophy which has prevailed in the West since Aristotle is a philosophy which offers certain fundamental grounds or principles, whether of being or of thought, from which everything else is supposed to flow in a necessary fashion. Now, dialectical approach has directed its criticism at this very point. It wants to criticise the idea that everything is fixed and everything should just flow from these principles. Adorno then explains that our reflections on concepts are not external from the concept, but rather the concept, or the word itself, drives us to qualify them. Quoting Hegel as an example, Adorno refers to the example of the terms all animals and zoology, writing that, just as when I say all animals, this expression cannot pass for zoology, so it is equally plain that the words the divine, the absolute, the eternal, etc., do not express what is contained in them. Whatever is more than such a word, even the transition to a mere proposition, contains a becoming other that has to be taken back, or is a mediation. Adorno goes on to explain that this alteration is not something external which our own reflections impose upon such a word or such a concept. It is rather that such a word or a concept drives us to qualify in the way that Hegel suggests. So, bearing that in mind, we will have a look at the Hegelian concept of mediation. The concept morphs as we comprehend it, and as Adorno writes, this is what the term mediation in Hegel refers to. He writes that the term mediation in Hegel always signifies a change or alteration which must be expected of a concept as soon as we wish to be apprised of the concept itself. Adorno writes more about Hegel's mediation and a person's natural response to dialectical thinking, and it's usually rejected, naturally because we don't like what's unfamiliar to us and we think this can't be right, as Adorno explains. If dialectic is the philosophy of universal mediation, this implies that there is actually no being which could evade the process of becoming once you attempt to determine it as such. This is the Hegelian concept of mediation. And speaking of this mediation, Hegel continues. But it is just this that met with horrified rejection. Now, this horrified rejection, which Hegel talks about, is indeed that hostile attitude to dialectic which we shall still have to confront, for essential reasons, whenever we attempt to understand the dialectic. For it springs from the idea that, if we fail to uphold our concepts unchanged, if we must change them in order to grasp them, if we insist that their being is a becoming, that truth itself is actually dynamic, then this amounts to a universal relativism that makes it impossible for us to say anything determinate about anything at all. So to me this says that everything's constantly morphing, constantly becoming. Nothing is static, being is becoming. And that's just one way of thinking about it. And this can be frustrating because, as Adorno explains, if things are constantly changing, then how can we say anything determinate about anything at all? This dialectical thought process, in which the concept is renewed continually, is not about manipulating concepts. But actually, it is something which should arise from the matter itself, from the thing that gives way to these concepts about itself. The concept arises from the thing, basically. What I think about a thing arises from the thing, which then influences the way I see the thing. It does not arise externally to the thing. And come in. This makes sense though, right? We look at a thing, and from this thing we get our idea about what the thing is. To think dialectically, the concept should arise from the matter. It is not we who bring concepts into movement. Dialectic is not the sort of thinking where we deploy concepts in very different senses in order to prove what we want to say. He adds that a movement of the concept is drawn from the matter itself and not something subsequently imposed upon the latter by ourselves. So you don't think, this is an orange, I'm going to make this become an orange, because then you look at it and go, I eat this, it's fruit, and that alters the way you see it. Always from the matter. It can't be solely from your mind onto the matter. So it seems like he's repeating himself a lot, but the following is a really illuminating quote, so I'm going to include it here. If we only abandoned ourselves unreservedly to the compulsion exercised by a particular object, by a particular matter, and pursue this single and specific matter unreservedly, then the ensuing movement is itself so determined out of the matter that it possesses the character of truth, even if the absolute, as an all-embracing totality, can never be given to us. This would be the concept of an open dialectic, in contrast to the closed dialectic of idealism. So yes, it does seem like he repeats himself a lot when he writes this text, but I think he's doing so that we rethink about what he's saying in a way that allows us to hermeneutically understand the concept of dialectic, because it's not something that you can just describe in a sentence. It's more a process you have to engage with, and the text is written in a way that forces you to engage with this process, I think. Adorno explains that the subject and object have to be identical with one another. That means that the concept has to adequately explain the thing in question, which can only then be done dialectically in the moment, because we're constantly changing and can't apply a concept from the past on an object now. Our needs and relationship with the object have changed, or they will have changed. An orange is a difficult one because, well, in the past it was more of a gift and it's more of an exotic fruit. I mean, we don't have to go into the actual history of the orange, but the nature of it has changed for us. It's still got vitamin C in it. This is something you're just going to have to dwell on. And I'm using an example of an orange because it's such a simple thing, but this can be applied to big, major concepts and issues like... I'm just using an orange because it's simple and it's such an inoffensive thing. I'm not here to start an argument. Adorno explains this notion about our concept and relationship with the object and such in relation to what Hegel means by the claim that the truth is the whole. When Hegel makes the famous claim that the truth is the whole, what he basically means is this: the sum of all mediation. That is to say, the sum of all those movements which must be accomplished if our essential concepts are to receive their full meaning. This comprehensive interrelationship of concepts, or that which ultimately emerges out of them, is the absolute in question. You can only really defend this claim if you also maintain that the subject and the object are identical with one another. Only if the subject and object ultimately coincide, as Hegel actually teaches, can you say that the comprehensive sum of all mediations is tantamount to the truth or the absolute itself, just as in Hegel the absolute is indeed defined at the highest level as subject-object. So when you conceive an object or whatever, you have your idea about what it might be, and then the object, then you have experience of the object, and that causes you to rethink how you see the object, and it constantly changes, and there's this mediation between that's not static and it's constantly changing and not fixed. And the sum, in reality, this wouldn't be to do with an orange. I mean, that's a very simple two-dimensional idea, but in reality the whole would be all these mediations and concepts, the to and fro between concept and subject, crossing and reforming itself dialectically, and this mediation part of constantly moving, not static, dynamic thing is the whole as Hegel teaches. It's not like there's this fixed thing from which you can then disseminate subsequent definitions and concepts, because that would imply something fixed and two-dimensional. It's alive, and it's like a I don't know, it's like an organism of concept and object and thought constantly becoming, kind of like electrons whizzing around and ionic bonds happening and not happening and all this. It's moving and changing and morphing and very metaphysical. And because the organism thing is so alive, the whole is so alive and dynamic, you have to then think of the subject and the object as being mediated by each other, and therefore being identical with one another. You can't separate them into fixed things. So that's what Hegel means by the whole being the truth. Adorno writes about Hegel's concept of the whole, which he seems to describe as being synonymous with the terms system and absolute. So this dynamic, not static mediation between concept and object that I've just tried to describe is synonymous with the terms like system and absolute. This confused me a bit at first, because system to me suggests something more mechanical, but maybe that's the point, because the whole comprises parts that don't stop moving and contradicting themselves. The whole is not homogeneous. Let's explore this notion more with Adorno's words. Adorno writes that Hegel's concept of the whole is not conceived as some kind of unfractured organic unity, for this whole is actually nothing other than what Hegel understands by system, namely the entire and developed range of all the relations between subject and object, and the antagonistic relations between subject and object, which are unfolded on their various levels. And then, when you think all of these relations together, when you finally see how the simplest concepts with which you begin eventually return to themselves as concepts, which have now been fully developed and critically classified, only then, according to Hegel, do you have what he understands by the system or the absolute. In other words, in Hegel, the system of philosophy is, in the highest sense, actually identical with being. But the concept of being here is not an enchanted word that stands right at the beginning and yields everything else. Rather, we could almost say that being, for Hegel, is a demand or program, something which only becomes what it is precisely through encompassing the entire movement of the concept. And that explains more clearly what I have just tried to explain. But let's unpack that quote more and figure out what he's saying to really get to the bottom of this. First, he doesn't want us to think of the whole as some kind of unfractured organic unity. You could say that, therefore, that it's not a mere synthesis of elements that come together homogeneously, that blend together as one. That's not what's happening. On the contrary, the whole is actually more antagonistic, and the components don't stop coming into contradiction. These contradictions that play out are the unity, or in Adorno's words, what Hegel understands by system, or the absolute. This is Hegel's whole. In Adorno's words, Hegel's version of this whole is actually the entire developed range of all the relations between subject and object, and the antagonistic relations between subject and object, which are unfolded on various levels. Adorno also explains that through all these continuously progressing contradictions or antagonisms, concepts are sort of renewed, reclassified for the present. They come back round again. So it's like, it would be great if we really all thought dialectically, because concepts that applied to the past that don't apply now can be rethought. This makes sense. Think of it as a basic iterative cycle. You think of an object and conceptualize it, and you use your conceptualization to comprehend the object. But here's where you need to keep adjusting your mindset if you want to think dialectically. You approach the object with your now narrowed preconceived ideas about it, and therefore must instead let the object speak to you. That is an orange, really. Reevaluate what you think you know about it. Let the concept you have about it be renewed in line with the concept's context. This is dialectical thinking, and it's when you critically think about an object without letting your interpretations be governed by preconceived ideas about the object. You're basically thinking for yourself in relation to the object within its given context. As Adorno writes in this quote here, the simplest concepts with which you begin eventually return to themselves as concepts which have now been fully developed and critically classified. And this continually becoming bunch of antagonistic relations that cause one to reevaluate concepts critically and continuously in a constant state of becoming is what Hegel views as the absolute, or the whole. In other words, the system. And like I said at the beginning of this section, maybe that's why the whole and the system are synonymous in this context. To Hegel, the whole comprises parts that don't stop moving and contradicting themselves. The whole is not homogeneous. And why is this the case? Why is the whole not homogeneous? Why is life like this? Well, as Adorno writes, what the whole really means for Hegel is quite simply that truth does not consist in defining some concept in isolation, treating it in isolation, as if it were a mere sector, but rather by taking it in relation to the totality in which it stands. You might want to argue here that this absolute is the result of all these antagonistic motions that continuously become, and so on. You might think, well, that's just the result, isn't it? That's the result. But to do this, to think of it in this way, you would be reifying the concept of result. Think about it. Also, this perception of dialectical thinking with a result like that is way too mechanical. There's got to be a balance. Because this idea of a result has missed the essence of dialectical thinking and reduced it to a mere method that isn't really connected to actually conceptualizing and working with contradictions. If you think there's a result. If you think process, result, you separate them, reify them. Dialectical thinking requires you to actually labour the concept, work at it. Because once it remains fixed, it's lost, it's reified. To think dialectically, you have to surrender to the experience of the matter in which you are conceptualizing. You could, in theory, call the whole the result, as long as you know that it is constantly becoming and not a fixed concept. You couldn't just say this is the answer to the antagonisms. It's not a result in that, that's it, scientifically proven. We don't have the answers, so we can't say that we do. This applies to proper concepts that we have somehow reified. The concept of the orange is a very simple concept. That's just inoffensive, as I keep saying. Adorno writes about this on pages 21 to 22 of An Introduction to Dialectics if you want to have a read of this. You could also say that the absolute is indeed the result, or that which emerges at the end of this movement. But then you must go on to reify this concept of result in turn, as if this result could now simply be found resumed in a couple of summary prepositions. That would still be a far too mechanical conception of dialectical thought, which fails to surrender itself to the experience of the matter, and the merely organicist approach, which simply strives to grasp some irrational wholeness. It's not properly thought and explored at all. So, like I'm talking about this dynamic thing between concept and object, the whole, it's not to be mechanical in the sense that you go through these propositions of subject and object and then you come to a result. Likewise, it's not supposed to be purely organicist, like it's an organism that works and you constantly feel it and live it, because that's too irrational. There has to be a balance, a mediation between something mechanical and something organic. We are still dealing with thought. Now, according to Adorno, Hegel does refer to truth being essentially the result. However, he doesn't mean it as we would interpret that. He doesn't mean it as something fixed that comes in at the end. This concept should not be envisaged as something finished that duly emerges at the end, which we can then simply carry away. In this context, result and truth mean that antagonistic bunch of contradictions that are continually becoming. In Adorno's words, when Hegel says that the truth is essentially a result, it concerns something in which, as it is constituted now, its own genesis and origin. The process and the path which has brought it to this point is sublated and comprehended. Usually when something is confusing in dialectics and, say, you're wondering whether the collection of antagonisms that make up the truth is the result of these antagonisms or the process of becoming that has no fixed result, for example, it's usually both. Dialectical thinking would say it's both. So that's kind of like a top tip if you're having trouble coming to it. And then once you can think about it as being both, you can think about it being both, you can think about why it's both. And that can help you unravel it. And in true dialectical fashion, Adorno says it's both. So it's both mechanical and organicist. And this is how it should be viewed if one wants to think dialectically. Truth is at once the process and the result of the process. That truth, whatever it is, emerges only at the end of this conceptual process. But this emergence is not simply external to this process. So it's both the process and the result of the process. But the result is not something external. That is the result. It's a different way of viewing the same thing. It's not a mere conclusion at the end that can now exist external to the contradictions. Those contradictions need to be engaged with constantly in their continuous antagonistic becoming. You have to keep thinking it, you have to labour the concept. Labour is a crucial word here. Okay, so we know so far that Adorno says that you have to surrender to the matter and let dialectical thinking arise from that. But this isn't to say that dialectical thinking is merely organicist. It's not. It involves an element of mechanical thinking, because we can't just let our intuition take over and surrender totally to the essence of matter. If we do this, we'll likely end up not thinking for ourselves, right? Think about it. And this is not what dialectical thinking is about at all. Having said this, dialectical thinking must not be mechanical, because that reduces it to a mere method, something fixed and static that can just be followed through systematically, and that misses the point completely of dialectical thinking. There's actually a fine line between mechanical and the organicist thought in dialectical thinking. You have to steer between them both, not getting too sucked into either. Adorno has a really nice metaphor that explains this issue. He writes that dialectic is precisely the kind of thinking which attempts to steer a path between the skilla of mechanistic and the... how to pronounce...
Scylla and Charybdis.
Dialectic is precisely the kind of thinking which attempts to steer a path between the skilla of mechanistic and the Charybdis of organicist or organological thought. For those of you wondering, because I did when I first read this, Scylla and Charybdis are monsters in Greek mythology. They both live at either side of a narrow channel of water. Sailors passing down this channel would want to avoid both monsters, but of course when they wanted to avoid, say, Scylla, they'd float dangerously close to Charybdis and vice versa. It's the same when trying to avoid mechanical and organic thinking. Once you try to avoid one, you end up naturally embodying too much of the other. It's basically about constantly re-evaluating what you think you know about the thing, purely in relation to the thing in question. I find this is useful if you're having an argument or discussion with someone and you want to see their side. Dialectics. There's always some sort of truth in the antagonism. So Adorno writes, on the one hand, we should not be content, as rigid specialists, to concentrate exclusively upon the given individual phenomena, but strive to understand these phenomena in the totality within which they function in the first place and receive their meaning. And, on the other hand, we should not hypostasize this totality, this whole, in which we stand, should not introduce this whole dogmatically from without, but always attempt to effect this transition from the individual phenomenon to the whole with constant reference to the matter itself. We must allow the matter to drive us beyond the merely inert individual determinations, while we must still retain the capacity to modify that whole whose concept we must possess in order to grasp the concept of what is individual, to modify the whole in such a way that it forfeits its rigid and dogmatic character. So that's Adorno putting it pretty simply, I think. And that's on page 25, so this whole chapter has literally just been about him explaining this in different ways. A dialectical process is both mechanical but also organic. The dialectical process is something which relates at once to both, to the parts, the individual moments which we must pass beyond by virtue of the whole, and to the whole itself. For the whole, the concept which we already have and which should ultimately constitute truth must continue to change in accordance with our experience of what is individual. Being dialectical, this is no recipe, but an attempt to let truth reveal itself. Takeaway points. Okay, let's try and summarise lecture 3 then. Without trying to reify it. Remain dialectical. Okay, truth is not static. It's constantly changing and becoming. Now, because truth is constantly changing and becoming, dialectical thought does not involve any principles or anything dogmatic, because this would imply something fixed, and it would imply an invariance of truth. Our reflections on concepts are not external from the concept, but rather the concept or word itself drives us to qualify them. The concept morphs as well as we comprehend it, and as Adorno writes, this is what Hegel's mediation refers to. This dialectical thought process in which the concept is renewed continually is not about manipulating concepts, but is actually something which should arise from the matter itself. The thing that gives way to these concepts about itself. And the truth is the whole. As Hegel puts it. In Adorno's word, the truth is the sum of all mediation. But it's not external to that mediation. It's not a solution, or a result, as you might think of a result in a scientific way. Words like whole, system, absolute are used synonymously, and Hegel's version of this whole is actually the entire and developed range of all the relations between subject and object, and the antagonistic relations between subject and object, which are unfolded on various levels. Adorno also explains that you might want to argue that the absolute here is the result of all these antagonistic motions that continuously become and so on. But to do this would be to reify the concept of result, because it is not some external solution outside the antagonisms, it is the antagonisms themselves. And if you think of that as a result as being synonymous with whole, system, absolute, in relation to these antagonisms, in relation to this mediation, then you're more on the right lines in terms of dialectical thinking. There's also a fine line between mechanical and organicist thought in dialectical thinking. You have to stay between them both, not getting too sucked into either. And also, dialectical thinking relates to both the individual parts and the whole, which is a collection of continuously becoming antagonisms. So it's both the whole and its parts. These lectures that I'm giving now are all very abstract at the moment, but I think the second half of the book, An Introduction to Dialectics, does apply these abstract concepts to actual examples, so hang on in there. It'll become more clear as we go through the book. This lecture repeats a lot of what the truth is the whole Oh God. But the following is a really illuminating quote, so I'm going is no static